Olá, pessoal. Aqui Luciana Genro, presidente da Fundação Lauro Campos Marielle Franco, e eu estou aqui com a Clara Mattei, que é uma intelectual, uma escritora, uma pessoa altamente qualificada, que vai conceder uma entrevista para nós aqui no canal da Fundação Crítica Marxista, como parte do nosso projeto de formação política. A Clara editou esse livro aqui no Brasil, A Ordem do Capital, Como Economistas Inventaram a Austeridade e Abriram Caminho para o Fascismo, pela editora Boitempo. E ela esteve recentemente no Brasil divulgando o livro, a convite da Boitempo, e a Fundação Lauro Campos Marielle Franco foi parte desse esforço para trazer a Clara aqui. Então, nós vamos conversar um pouquinho com ela em inglês, vocês podem acompanhar pelas legendas, quem não entender inglês. E vamos falar sobre o livro e também sobre os novos projetos que a Clara está desenvolvendo agora, nesse momento. So, Clara, thank you very much for talking to us. It's really a pleasure talking to you. We from Lauro Campos and Marielle Franco Foundation, we are very happy to participate in the effort to bring you to Brazil on July the 30th. I had already read your book and I was very excited about the possibility of talking to you. It's a shame I couldn't go to the event as we were, and I am still dealing with the consequences of the flood that devastated Rio Grande do Sul. It was really a tragedy, so I couldn't fly to São Paulo. This interview is part of our political education project called Marxist Critique, organized by Lauro Campos and Marielle Franco Foundation, with the support of Revista Movimento website. We will publish it on our foundation's communication platform and share it with PSOL members across the country. So very welcome, nice. Clara.
Thank you.
Did you like to come to Brazil?
Yes, absolutely. I found the Brazilian people I met to be extremely capable of challenging certain well-established notions and a sense by which really one could act to try to change the economic status quo. So that is something that actually was very empowering to see. You know, I'm used to in the United States or in Italy, where I'm from originally, there's a sense of just passive acceptance that is very, very entrenched. While, I mean, of course, this might be just a superficial impression, but the superficial impression was that instead in Brazil, also the young generation has much more of a sense that one can fight for radical economic change, and that of course is more urgent than ever for so many reasons, and especially for what is currently happening in terms of our economic support to the genocide in Gaza. And this support is really, especially from the West, but, you know, also in Brazil. I was reading that Brazil is the fourth biggest trade partner in oil with the Netanyahu government. So, you know, the complicity and the deep connections between all forms of economic violence are obvious. And for this reason, it's very important for us to have conversations that question what usually people take for granted. And we really need to fight to not take for granted the basis of public discourse, because it really, really blinds us to see what actually are a lot of the potentialities that I think in Brazil are really present in terms of social and economic alternatives.
Sure. Tell me, you have a new project ongoing in February. What are you going to do?
Thank you. We are inaugurating a center for heterodox economics. The name of the center is going to be Che, to inspire us from, of course, Che Guevara. And the idea is to build one place that can bring together and many struggles, both in the United States and especially abroad. So I really hope to build some strong connections with Brazil. It's going to be based in the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but the idea is really to create a hub to break the boundaries of academia, to actually be a point of reference for citizens who want to change their economic conditions. And I know this is very, very already happening. In Brazil, for example, there is MADE as an institute, there's Traversa. There's a lot of, I think, think tanks in Brazil that are already trying to bring together public intellectuals who are truly critical and broader citizenship. So we're going to do a small part of this, attempt that is, of course, worldwide, also in Tulsa, and I will be directing the center.
Very good. Congratulations. This is very important.
Thank you.
Let me introduce our talk about your book. But before we talk about the emergency of austerity policies, I wanted to analyze the previous situation and how World War I influenced the emergence of Keynesian policies of state intervention in the economy. Your book narrates the fact that before World War I, Adam Smith's laissez-faire ideas in economics were predominant thought and practice in the world. During the war, this model was dismantled, and the state had to intervene heavily in the economy to guarantee the war effort, and in the post-war period, the reconstruction of the economies and countries that were devastated by the war. And this change ended up generating, as you tell in the book, a popular feeling that there was another possible model and that the state intervention could be an alternative to guarantee better living conditions for the population. So I'd like you to talk a little about this and how was this process like, this transition to this feeling of the people that there was another alternative.
Thank you. Absolutely. So first, just one brief comment, which is that in my work, I think that the book Ordem do Capital is an attempt to really show people how historical studies can really help open up our political and conceptual imagination. So because looking at history, one is capable of really seeing how not all the time were the conditions of present day capitalism so obvious and eternal. So the analysis I do, which took place 100 years ago, right after the First World War, so basically starting from 1914, and I focus on the early 20s, speaks to us directly for many reasons. The first reason we can perhaps discuss is what, Luciana, you were pointing out, which is that actually the Great War, so again, what we know as First World War, but at the time it was the Great War, was a shock for citizens, especially in Europe. And what happened was that it became clear in a very practical sense how the idea that the market society was something spontaneous, obvious, and never ending was pure ideology, right? So this is very important because part of what critique is about, right? Critica Marxista, critique is about really breaking out of these common sense ideas that trap us. And as one of the common sense idea is that something like the laissez-faire economy was even something. A laissez-faire economy is a complete construction in the sense that markets constantly require state intervention to protect the pillars of capitalism, namely, especially private property of the means of production and wage relations. So while until the First World War, the global elite was capable of maintaining the pretense of this spontaneous system by which we could all just watch and things would happen on their own according to, who was more virtuous would gain. With the war, it was obvious that instead, for capital accumulation to be efficient, especially in a moment in which countries had to win against their enemies, in order for the economy to be efficient and capital accumulation to work, the state was essential, especially to maintain a higher rate of exploitation. So you see that really the state played a fundamental role in preserving the capacity for the countries to produce quickly in order to win the war, to produce food, armaments, all of sorts of the technological necessities to win the war. This was far from spontaneous. This required the state to step in more than it had done until then. And by stepping in more, it revealed that capital is not just wealth. Capital is primarily the social relation of production by which workers go to sell their capacity to labor in return for a wage. What the state did during the war was maintain very much in place the relation of exploitation that was so crucial in order to produce quickly, produce efficiently, and win the war. So this is very important because what I study is how the state especially disciplined workers in a very explicit way. For example, in Italy, the workforce was militarized, meaning that if the workers decided not to go to their job the next day in the factories, they could get fined or even persecuted for treason. So this shows how what is the implicit and so fundamental element that preserves the illusion that the system is spontaneous, which is the fact that no one forces us to go to work. We just have to because otherwise we don't survive. What is known as economic coercion, what is typical of capitalism, right? The worker is exploited in a way that is not so obvious because he sells his capacity to work on the market and no one is obliging him to do it. Of course, if he doesn't, he does not survive. He becomes destitute. He cannot exist. During the war, it became much more obvious that it was about political coercion because if the state obliged the workers to work. And this made it such that exploitation, which is a reality under capitalism, became much more evident. And because it became overtly political, because of this interventionism of the state. So this is one, of course, there's many aspects. I cannot talk about everything. I hope you can read it. This is especially in the first part of the book. But this aspect is crucial because once people realize that capital accumulation required exploitation, and they saw how unjust exploitation is, especially during the war, meaning that the sacrifice for winning a war that was based on the necessity for capital accumulation to advance was done on the blood and of workers, both in the trenches, but also in the workforce. Well, after the war, people demanded a radical alternative to this. So basically, I try to show how the war was a trigger point so that the veil of consensus fell, and a large amount of different movements, both at the level of government and at the level of grassroots organization, especially, for example, in the countrysides with the workers occupying the land, something that, of course, in Brazil still very much exists, were workers in Italy taking over the big latifundia and running production through assemblies democratically, or in the factories, the councils, the workers' councils. Antonio Gramsci is a protagonist of the first part of my book. And I show how really the councils meaning the assemblies in the factories in Fiat, for example, were considered the embryo for a new post-capitalist state in which the state was not going to be alienated from the people and exploiting of the people, but the state was going to be actually a representation of these councils through a federal understanding of government that was horizontal and not representative in its bourgeois form. So this is very interesting how there were all these institutional experimentations that were very strong and very appealing because they were showing how production of resources and distribution of resources could happen on completely different bases that did not require wage relations, did not require private property of the means of production. So for us, it is a very inspiring moment. And again, for me, what's interesting is that in Brazil, these realities still do exist. And so I think as Brazilians, you should be very proud because we know that, for example, self-managed factories are a reality in Brazil. There's still over 50 that are self-organized. And this is not something so obvious because there's basically none in the United States. I think there's one, and there are very, very few in Europe. And so what you see is that historically, though, these movements, if extended, can really serve to empower people to say, no, we want economic agency. We want a society that is based on radically different principles. And this is not just utopia. This is reality.
Right. Very good. One thing that caught my attention is that your book tells these parallel stories about the triumph of austerity in Great Britain and in Italy. And Great Britain is the birthplace of classical liberalism, and Italy, the birthplace of fascism. And these parallel stories demonstrate that austerity transcends all ideological and institutional differences, meeting the needs to guarantee the accumulation of capital. What was the difference in these two processes, in which, in one case, a liberal regime was maintained, Britain, and in the other, the fascism rose to power, like in Italy? Why and how this process, so different process, walked in parallel?
Thank you. Yes. So this is one, I think, of the powerful messages of the book derives from my methodological choice to undertake a comparison that on the surface seems rather odd. At the surface, it seems as if the Italian context in the 1920s and the British context could not be more distant, more different. Why? Well, as you just said, Luciana, because we have on one side a country like Italy that was really the periphery of Europe in the sense of very dependent on international capital, very underdeveloped, right? And also the birthplace, of course, of the first fascist regime ever, and the name fascism comes from, in fact, the Movimento dei Fasci d'Azione, which was, in fact, a movement founded by Benito Mussolini that then became a party and then, of course, took power, not by coup, but by actually institutional agreement with the liberals in order to resolve the crisis of capitalism that was mainly represented, of course, by the council movement and the occupation of the land. So on the one side we have Italy, on the other side we have Great Britain, that of course is the cradle of classical parliamentary liberalism, but it's also, the empire, the hegemon. It was just losing its primacy with the United States that had been starting to become the biggest creditor of the world after the First World War. So very different scenarios. And what is important to notice, and this is the message that is very thought-provoking, but also provoking politically, which is to say that when it comes to protecting the capital order, right, this same the capital order that had been deeply questioned immediately after the war, the same capital order that was not spontaneous, but required explicit political discipline of the majority of the citizens. Well, in a moment in which the pillars of capitalism were shaking, and this was happening also in Great Britain, and this is very interesting because there's very little scholarship. Actually, I think my book is one of the very few that tries to show that even it was not just in Russia and in Eastern Europe that there were revolutionary, of course, realities. In Britain itself, in 1919, nobody, even those in parliament, were thinking that capitalism could last for very long. Everyone, also the bourgeoisie in power, was ready in one form or another to move on. Right. So it's here in a moment in which really the capital order was finding it very difficult to survive, that the weapon of austerity is experimented with and applied in order to eliminate any possible alternative economic order. And so what I show is how what was this austerity code that was actually in a way I don't like the word invented, even if the title of the book says invented, because for me, austerity is in the DNA of capitalism. What we can say, though, is that austerity became very clearly used as an active way to reassert the order after the First World War, during the famous conferences of Brussels and Genoa, 1920, 1922, the first international financial conferences in which economists, experts were brought to the conferences to advise governments. And how they advise governments is through austerity. And this austerity was applied in extremely similar ways in Britain and in Italy, with the same result of bringing back a hierarchical organization of production and distribution, and ultimately an increasing rate of exploitation. So I don't know if your next question is about, of course, defining more austerity. We can get into it more, but I just wanted to show how, in a way, these different worlds, fascism and liberalism, were actually much closer than it seems when it comes to defending capitalism. And actually it gets worse. Last word I want to say, it gets worse because the archival research I undertook, and it took me a while and it was tedious, but the evidence is crushing. The evidence is crushing that liberals, not only in Italy, but also in Great Britain and in the United States, were extremely supportive of Benito Mussolini, both in terms of lending economic support, but especially lending ideological support. Again, because Mussolini was a great student of austerity. He was great at applying austerity. He was great at having economists run the Italian economic reforms. And this was understood as a miracle. A country that had been so turbulent and revolutionary, finally industrial peace was back. Finally, savings were higher. Finally, the budget was balanced. And finally, international investors could make profits again in that country. So also the story is not just a parallel, but also how, in a way, Mussolini would not have become the fascist dictator he has been 20 years, in power, without the active support of liberals, both in Italy and especially abroad.
But do you think that the Italian bourgeoisie needed fascism in order to implement austerity, and in Britain they didn't need it?
So, as always, the counterfactuals in history don't make much sense. What I can say is definitely that in Italy, the conversation was about the fact that the governments in power immediately after the war, that were governments that were kind of like, reformist. They were trying to appease the population through some form of welfare state reforms, like proto-Keynesianism, as you were pointing out in your previous question, these were seen by the ruling elite as being very, very weak governments. So I don't know if in different conditions, one could have pressured these weaker governments to be less democratic in a way, in the sense of, being less pressured from below, but instead following the experts that the United Nations, the League of Nations, what now is the League of Nations of the time, was pressuring. But definitely what they saw immediately was that Benito Mussolini was much more convincing because of his capacity to be very firm, right? He came to power with the idea, I am going to be very firm to stop these unacceptable demands coming from the populace, coming from, these poor people that have no rights to, in a way, exert their economic agency. So this was particularly appealing. Now, one could say, well, in Britain, they were able to apply austerity without fascism. And one can say absolutely, but one can also say that, of course, in the degree of revolutionary spectrum in Italy, the situation was much more tense because there was much less identification with the bourgeois state as in Britain. And in Britain, what is very important is that they already had in power very strong economic institutions for at least a century, namely the Bank of England and the British Treasury. So these technocratic institutions were anyway, it's like today, right? Today, who really calls the decisions? It's the central bank that is independent, and it is the Minister of Finance, right? The same was happening there, in the sense that it's actually these technocratic institutions that were calling the shots. They were deciding on the economic policy and were able to actually maintain their priorities that could, of course, go against the demands of the people. This was much more difficult in Italy because these technocratic institutions did not really exist. So the capitalist state was more fragile for the purposes of austerity.
Sure. Well, let's talk about present now, because in Europe and also here in Brazil, we have seen austerity policies also being implemented by governments led by social democratic parties, like PT, like the Workers' Party here in Brazil, and the traditional left in general. Do you think that these austerity policies they help the growth of the far right? Because we see here in Brazil and many other countries around Europe that have been governed by social democratic parties that implement austerity. The far right has grown. Do you think one thing is connected to the other?
Completely and absolutely. There's now just the recent electoral result in Germany, right? And there's two regions in Germany that have seen the neo-Nazi parties win the election. So it's constantly happening. Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. So what we see here is how what I try to explain is how the rise of, in a way, ultra right-wing parties is the expression of the success of austerity. And by this, what I mean is that austerity is exactly meant not really to balance the budget or cure inflation. These are, rhetoric, to actually do what is most fundamental, which is to take away resources from workers so as to make them more docile, more precarious, more willing to accept lower wages, worse labor conditions, and really propose what is the best scenario for profits to surge. So if we understand austerity as not about, a technical tool to have better balanced budgets, but as a political means to safeguard what is most fundamental, again, the wage relations, most fundamental is that people don't feel that they can do much else than to go work for a wage. This is the priority, the precondition for capitalism to work, which is exactly what bourgeois economists and mainstream media never problematizes, right? Because that's taken for granted. That's not to be taken for granted, because this is the whole point of Marx's critique, right? Is actually, let's avoid taking for granted what others take for granted, so as to make sure we never question what is most fundamental. Now, if we understand austerity as being more fundamentally about class relations, more fundamentally about maintaining a hierarchical way of producing and distributing resources, then we understand that disempowering people, making them feel scared, precarious, individualized, without hope, the sentiments that have the far right grow, right? The fear of those who are even, of course, weaker than you, the scapegoat, oh, it's the migrant, no, it's this type of sentiments are exactly the product of, I would say, of centuries of austerity. And in this, of course, latest 50 years, austerity has only skyrocketed everywhere. So, and of course, who is to blame is also the self-defined left or the parliamentary left, because ultimately it is the self-called left that is most usually committed to the austerity policies. Now, so we see that what is important here is that the rise of neo-Nazism or fascism or whatever we want to call it, far right and Bolsonarismo and whatnot, Trump, etc. These are problems for the people. They're not problems for capitalism, because we very well know that capitalism works best under authoritarian and non-democratic violent regimes. And this history has shown over and over. I look at fascism in Italy. We can look, of course, at the case of Chile, at the case of Suharto in Indonesia, at so many different cases historically in which it is demonstrated in obvious ways how those liberals who are supposedly democratic say, you know what, fascism is ultimately more efficient in running the capital order. So again, the rise of the right is not a problem for capitalism, is a problem for people. And it is the result of very successful austerity recipes that fall most often under the wing of the self-stylized left. Now, why does the self-stylized left do austerity? Because ultimately, if one is not willing to question the foundations of our society, if one is not willing to, for example, give space to the occupation of land, to self-management, to democratic ways of running, ecological ways of running local resources, if that's not an option, and the option is only to be dependent on private investors and to please the markets, then austerity is the way, right? So this is the trap. If we want capitalism, we go with austerity. There's very little alternative otherwise, because if you start socially distributing resources, this is going to be very problematic for the economic fundamentals of, for example, having a balance of trade. If you import too much, the markets do not like it. So people have to be kept poor so that the real or any other currency is strong. So you see how the system operates if people are weak and poor. This is how the system best operates. And it is a fact that you can be internationally competitive if you export more, if you thus compress wages to be more competitive while avoiding too much imports. And this is exactly what someone like Lula is also grappling with. Do you want to, take into consideration what the needs of people? Or are we taking into consideration the need of capital? If we're taking into consideration the need of capital, then it's going to be crushing the needs of people. And I think this is really, really the issue here.
Yeah, that's what was my next question, because what is the alternative? How difficult and politically complex is to resist to the logic of fiscal austerity? If you are in a country that is central to capitalism and an anti-austerity leftist party comes to power, do you think it's possible to implement an anti-austerity policy within the limits of capitalism, within the limits of the nation? Or you have to go for let's say, a government of rupture with the system and with the capital?
Well, see, I think this is really the question of our times. And in my own work, now also right now, I'm writing a book that tries to look at the Keynesian years of the post-Second World War, so the Golden Age, so-called Golden Age, because I think it is helpful to demystify the idea that it's so easy to stay under capitalism and do actual social welfare and actually care for the people. I think realistically, historically, our economic system has shown, and this also in the global north, right, and more than ever, of course, in the global south, that there are clear, at once, economic and political limits to how much human priorities we can have under capitalism. So this will need a whole other book to show. I would like to show how also in the United States in the 60s and 70s, the priority of keeping down inflation and maintaining investors' confidence took precedence over any form of social redistribution. But this, I think, is, of course, still more than ever the case today. So to be more explicit, I do think that the real issue is here: how much can one have the political courage to break from dependence on international investors, right? So if one is willing, and again, it's not about economic necessities, about political will. I do think that a country like Brazil, for example, has the conditions to maintain a very solid economy by breaking with the speculation of financial investors that right now are the main reason why the Lula government is pressured to constantly cut social spending, to constantly increase interest rates. So this speculation on the currency is something that one can break if one says, you know what, I'm going to try to depend on other productive resources that are not foreign capital. So this is the first thing. Now, how much then do we want to depend on domestic capital is the other question. And I think here it is again about politicizing the economy. And I think if we politicize the economy, we realize that it's not either black or white, right? It's not, I think the point is that post-capitalist alternatives emerge in the making. So already if one is able to pressure the government in power right now in Brazil and elsewhere to really support the alternative ways of producing and distributing that already exist in Brazil, to actually enhance this energy for alternative relations that are existing, that I think is the first step to try to see if there is space, in fact, to construct a path towards a different economy. So I don't know if I was very clear in the response. My response would be, I think historically it is much more utopian to try to to care about the welfare of the people if we within the current capitalist structure. I think that the reality is that, especially due to the pressing also climate disasters that you've been witnessing very closely yourself, and of course the constant explosion of war and killing of innocent people, I think more than ever it is the case that the logic of profit, that is the logic that dominates our economy today, is incompatible with the logic of needs. And today more than ever this is shown. So I think it's utopian to try to fit the logic of profit into accepting the priority of need, because this is actually really, really, really complicated. More, I think, realistic would be to say, hey, okay, in this current moment, what are the strengths on the ground to build a different economic model with different priorities that is actually ecological, democratic, empowering for those who produce? Well, I think Brazil has a lot of that on the ground. And the whole point here is that a government like the government of Lula could give space to this parallel reality so that it can grow. And I think in this case, it is then, we can't imagine in advance, but it is then that one can then see how far one can push the system from within to break out of it, right? And I think that's how things move forward, is from the current moment. This is exactly what happened after the First World War, is that from the current conditions, people started moving in a different direction. And so this would be my answer. Of course, it's quite general, but absolutely, I think it is right now completely absurd to try to please the markets and to please the people. And if you try to please the markets, what happened is that the far right wins, gains electorate, and then of course this is a gain once more for our capital order.
But what do you think would be possible a pacific transition to another model, or the bourgeoisie would react, and so the people would have to be very strongly united and organized to face the consequences of a different economic model?
Yeah, I think two things. One is that, there's nothing peaceful about our current reality, both in terms of the amount of lives being lost because of the profits of the military industrial complex, but also the violence at all levels that are like the result of our way of producing and distributing. So violence is everywhere. The point here is to realize how frightened the elite in power constantly is about potential change, because also of sheer numbers. We saw what happened in Bangladesh. Now, of course, they're being co-opted once more by economists who are not going to allow for much of a social transformation. But if people, actually stop working, if people actually go in the streets, you can change the political leadership. This is a reality. So numbers matter. And I think the point here is that what matters is also the empowerment of autonomous production spaces of production, so that you can be less blackmailable if you already are growing a community that is self-sufficient in many ways. And so in this sense, the reaction of the ruling elite is unpredictable, but definitely is going to be a reaction that in one way or another will try to maintain power. But the majority right now has all the interest in properly participating in trying to change the current economic system. And I think right now more than ever, people have nothing to lose. And the fact that people have nothing to lose, goes both ways, in the sense that, of course, that is again the expression of the success of austerity, is that people ultimately become very depoliticized, having to worry about getting to the end of the month, having to worry about surviving, having completely bent their neck to the capital order, have lost political awareness, have lost the possibility of even finding time to congregate and discuss issues that are collective. But at the same time, I do think that we are talking about a generalized moment in which there is very little that currently the ruling elite can say people would lose if they tried to for radical social transformation. So one should really try to gain from this reality, and I think especially build international connections. And this is something that the current movements in the ground in Brazil know how to do very well, I think, and I hope will continue to do. One last thing I wanted to say, because I think the conversation didn't really address um, the definition that I try to propose of austerity. And this can help the conversation we're having now, because we need to break away from the idea that austerity is really a virtuous way to live within our means. And, for example, avoid having too big of a hole in the budget. Because what you realize right now is that austerity is actually responsible for a huge hole in the budget, right? So what you see right now is that austerity everywhere does not mean that the state does not spend. It means that the state is spending in favor of the capital holding elite. And this has nothing to do with the necessity to make the 2025 zero deficit mark. Because actually, if really governments took seriously the need to balance the budget, they would not be spending an insane amount of money, both for, of course, funding wars, but also for private investors, de-risking them, subsidizing them. The public is constantly subsidizing private investors. And of course, there's also the issue that private investors pay zero taxes. So I actually had one number I wanted to share with you because I find it quite astonishing, which is give me just 1 second so I open it.
We have here the interests of the national debt. That is something amazing. The amount
Yes.
of money that the government spends in interests is much more than it spends in health, in
Exactly.
education, and many other
Exactly.
public services.
That is very important, right? Because the state did not incur into debt to build schools or for the Bolsa Familia. 82% of the increase in public debt in Brazil results from accumulated interest, right? So what we see right now is that if you count the interest payments added to tax evasions that are allowed, of course, for the wealthy ones, and tax exemptions, right? The fact that actually wealthy people just don't pay taxes, especially corporation. This leads, according to my colleague Ladislao Dalbor, who I'm sure you know, to 30% of Brazil's GDP that has been transferred away from the workers to capital holders. So this is, again, why it's so important to understand that austerity is not about the whole. It's not about the state, if the state spends or not, but where the state decides to spend and who the state decides to actually support, right? So here we see it's really about this transfer of resources away from people for those that hold capital. And this, once more, helps protect wage relations because it does make us into more vulnerable human beings that have no alternatives but to go work for a wage. So it makes a lot of sense for the system, but once more, we should not fall prey of the false idea that what these government officials are doing is actually care about supposedly like curing inflation or balancing the budget. Interest rates going up do not cure inflation. What they do is give the wealthiest 10% of Brazilian society, that are the private holders of governmental debt, a lot of money, while of course there's very little money to then give social services to people, and there will be less and less. Okay, so this is really, really important to me, is how we have to also problematize the definition of austerity that we usually find in the media. And once more, it's not about inflation, it's not about balanced budgets, it's about reassuring the conditions for favorable private investment. And the way out of this is to say, maybe we don't need to rely on private investment in the first place. Maybe we can think about forms of activities that are truly democratic. And by democratic, one does not mean top-down bureaucracy from above. One means getting people to participate in their own existence concretely. And this also does resolve a lot of mental health issues that many young people have by feeling so useless, so separate, so in a way alienated from their own communities.
Perfect. So I just thank you very much for this conversation. I think it's very useful for us that are struggling against austerity, even in a government led by the Workers' Party, and for the people to understand how important it is to organize and to participate in politics. We are in the verge of municipal elections here in Brazil, and choosing the mayors of the city is part of building an alternative for the country, because the far right is still strong here, and it is intending to come back to power in the next general elections 2 years from now. And the municipal election is part of the struggle to avoid them to come to power again. So your book and the conclusions you draw from all the story you tell, the history you relate, is very important for us.
I'm very glad to try to be able to give just a small contribution. Two last words that I think are relevant. One is that, once more, austerity is not just about fiscal and monetary policy, it's also about industrial policies. And privatization is a very important element of austerity that we should keep in mind when discussing austerity. That's why I try to really broaden the definition to the austerity trinity, because labor relations are key to the whole story. And two, I also wanted to say that I think the real message to push is that if the current Lula government does not take the courage to operate in a way that can really go against the logic of austerity, which of course is not easy because it means going against the logic of capital more generally, the results will be the obvious win of the far right. So I think right now there is, again, political reasons why it makes sense, even from an electoral point of view, to try to drastically change the direction of the economic policies. No more pleasing the markets. That leads us nowhere. That is a completely myopic and short-run view, but really trying to explore different foundations for our economy. So I hope there will be more of that, and I think young students will definitely help out, and that's why I hope that the Center for Heterodox Economics will allow for greater conceptual tools to be developed. And then, of course, it's all about political engagement. Things don't happen thanks to ideas of academics, of course.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Clara. So good luck for you in your projects. I'm willing to read your new book about Keynesian policies. It's probably going to be very interesting. So I hope Boitempo can publish it here again, as it did for this one. Let me show again to our viewers the Clara Mattei book. It's very good, important contribution to our struggle and to our knowledge about the history of the austerity and the history of the struggle against it. So thank you, Clara.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luciana.
Bye-bye.